I'm so grateful to my friend Zach as he agreed to do this. We are looking forward to this discussion. You know, the second most common question or statement that people have asked me about this is he really an atheist? And Zach is really an atheist. He really doesn't believe that there's a God, and he really doesn't believe that the resurrection, but he's an awesome guy. And I think you guys are going to see that through this evening. I think you're going to grow to love him. I think you're going to grow to care about him. I think he's going to win you over in many areas. And I'm excited and just so grateful that he was willing to come to a church on Monday, Thursday, in a den full of lambs and sit with you guys and be a part of this. And we are excited about this. Just real quick, I wanted to give you some goals for the evening. Really, why do we do this? Because that was another question. People were asking me, why are we doing this? It's a church. It's a person that doesn't hold a position that we hold on the belief on God and Jesus Christ. Why are we doing this? And I wanted to just give you kind of a framework for why we're here this evening. The first thing I wanted you to see as Christians, as believers, is that there are some really good reasons to believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ occurred. And I think I'm going to present those tonight. Hopefully, I'll make a solid case for the resurrection. Another thing that I wanted you to see tonight was that atheists can be really nice people. In my encounters with people that don't believe like we believe, I found out that there's more people that are winsome and caring and loving more than the opposite of many times we paint them in a bad broad stroke and we paint them in an evil character. And so I want you to see tonight that Zach is a really intelligent guy. Zach is really well thought out, and he's really a nice guy. And you're going to see, hopefully walking away from tonight, is maybe that's not what I expected. I expected him to maybe be vitriolic. I expected him to be argumentative. And I think what you're going to see through the evening is that he is a really great guy, and he represents a position that has some really good people. I think all worldviews, all religions have people that can scar them, but I also think that there are people that can paint a positive picture, and I hope that that happens tonight. A third thing I wanted you to see was civil discourse and discussion. That I think one of the things that's lost on our society is that people don't know how to have conversations anymore. It seems through political or through religious or whatever it is, maybe a social, that it's if we don't agree on this one position, then we can't have a discussion or we can't have a debate. And hopefully what I want you to see tonight is that Zach and I are going to widely disagree on the resurrection, and yet at the end of the night, we're going to agree on so much. One of the things that Zach and I talked about is that we believe that the church needs to be different in the way that it approaches some of these questions and these objections, and that's something that I've been working tirelessly for the last 10 years, and that's something that Zach has been working on, trying to encourage the church to be more open to skeptics, to be more open to questions and doubt. And so tonight, if you swing to the fence where you say, I side with Zach, or you swing to the fence and you say that you side with my position, hopefully you'll see that we can have a solid discussion and discourse about this. If you're here tonight and you're hoping to see an annihilation, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't think that's going to happen. At least at this point, I don't. Maybe Zach will disagree on that. Maybe we will see annihilation. But the truth is Zach's going to bring up some really good points tonight. And there's going to be some things that I may not be able to answer. There may be some things that I haven't thought about. There may be some things that he'll bring up, and you'll go home tonight and you go, man, that was a really good point. I don't know if we really gave a good answer to it. I don't think that tonight is going to be a slam dunk for him. I don't think tonight's going to be a slam dunk for me. I think what you're going to see is that he's going to have some really good points, and hopefully I have some really good points on the position of the resurrection. When I talk to people about debates, one of the things I like to use as an illustration is this. It's kind of like a scoreboard mentality. When you start talking about a debate, it's not whether somebody can win 100-0, but it's who can make the strongest case or the strongest arguments. And so I use this illustration for my students, and I would tell them that if you look at this scoreboard, you realize the home team had 105 points. And so all of us look at that instinctively and say, well, they won the contest. Although 14:59 left in the game, there's not a lot of defense being played in this game. But here's the point. You look at this and you say, but the guests scored 96 points. Zach is going to make some really good arguments tonight that I may not be able to answer. That does not mean that the resurrection is false. I'm going to make some really good points tonight, hopefully, that Zach's not going to be able to answer. That does not necessarily mean that I win. It's the evaluation to say, case by case, point by point, who's going to make the best argument. You are able to walk out of here tonight and still be a Christian and say, you know what? I think Zach made a better presentation. That's okay. You may walk out of here tonight and say, you know what? I don't believe in the resurrection, but I think Joe made a better case. It's a point by point. And so hopefully in our event for that tonight, hopefully we can do that. Hopefully we can make that clear on both points. In matters of and I want to be very clear on a couple of things here. I don't represent all of Christianity. And so there are going to be some things tonight that I'm not going to know the answer to. That doesn't mean that there's not an answer out there. That just means in tonight's debate, I don't know the answer. And I would also say to you that there will be some questions that I believe Zach will bring up that we probably don't have a great answer for yet as Christians. And what I would tell you is what Aristotle said, is that when you come to an area of skepticism or debate, he said, the first thing I would do is pray, and the second thing I would do is wait for later revelation. There are some really good objections that Zach's going to bring up tonight. I don't think we need to throw away the resurrection, but I think we need to continue to study and to find ourselves ready to do that. I want to end with this real quick. Many people have talked to me about this, and one of the underlying questions that's been through this is, why are you doing this? You're a pastor of a church. Your goal in life is to reach as many people, to tell them about Jesus Christ. And so this would seem rather counterintuitive to bring somebody who's going to bring an opposing idea into this. Why would you do that? Why would you invite an atheist to the pulpit? Why would you invite an atheist to the stage? And what I would tell you is that my passion is to reach the lost, but I think my passion is also to secure the saved. And that hopefully tonight we're going to give you good reasons to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And I want to prepare you. And that's going to be scary at times, and there's going to be moments where you're going to question and you're going to doubt. But I think that's part of the process of growing. You know, every fall we do this when we come into the flu season. When we come around to flu season, what do? We all go and get a shot. We get a vaccination. And whenever you get a vaccination, you're getting a weakened form of the virus. And what happens in your body is your body starts to build up antibodies so that when you come in contact with the real thing, you are prepared to deal with it. Hopefully tonight we're putting ideas into your head and we're preparing you so that when you have a discussion with a person like Zach, or you read a book, or you come across an article or YouTube channel, that these are not foreign ideas to you, but that we've prepared you and that we've equipped you for this. And hopefully tonight that is part of that transition. I want to just real quickly give you a format for the evening tonight and tell you about how this is going to work. Most debates are very formal and very structured. We're going to try to stay away from that tonight. We really, in our discussion, we wanted to make this as conversational as possible, that it was like you were sitting in on a coffee shop and you were getting to watch us just have a conversation about the resurrection. And so hopefully we do that tonight. Tonight, Zach and I are going to be using what we call, or at least what I call, apologetics. And apologetics is a Christian position to give a defense for what we believe. And so when you're talking to somebody and they say, well, I don't believe in a God, and you start to give an answer to the questions that they have, that would be apologetics. Tonight, our topic will be centered around the resurrection. Zach does not believe that the resurrection occurred historically. I do believe that the resurrection occurred historically, and so I'm going to give a defense for that. I'm going to be doing apologetics. Now, apologetics has not always been popular in the church. There has been some times when the church has stayed away from it. There have been times that Christians have used apologetics poorly, myself included. I like to say that sometimes apologetics falls into what I call the 4 A's. We're too academic, we're too autonomous, we're too arrogant, and we're too argumentative. My goal tonight is that we don't do any of those things. There may be times where it becomes tense between us, but I hope we don't argue. There may be times where we put out things there that are very philosophical, or there may be things that are very heavy academically. Hopefully we don't bore you to death. We want to try to keep this on a conversational level. Just kind of by a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to a live debate before? Okay, hands down. How many of you would say you've never been to a live debate before? Okay, so this will be your first interaction, and so hopefully we do a great job of presenting that to you tonight, something that's not too academic, not too arrogant, not too argumentative. My goal is to avoid that tonight. The format for this evening will be as follows. We're going to have an argument. We're going to have 5 points. I'm going to make 5 cases for the resurrection. Zach's going to make 5 reasons why he feels like the resurrection did not occur. Each point we get 2 minutes to make, so it's going to be very quick. He's going to make his case, I'm going to make my case, and then we have 2 minutes for rebuttal to each other. Will is going to be our moderator tonight. I'll introduce you to him in a second. And he's going to be given the task of keeping us on time, making sure that we stay on point. And then after we're done with that, we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. So be thinking of questions as we go around, be taking notes, and then Will will be going around, passing around the mic, making sure that he can get all of your questions. That'll lead us to just the beginning of this. William, if you would just go ahead and take it from there and get us started.
Well, good evening. Hey, guys. How are y'all? If you guys know me, you know I am super passionate about apologetics. My name's William Battle. I am the kids pastor over at the Rockwall campus. And apologetics, the reason why I'm so passionate about it is actually apologetics is the reason I came back to the faith. I was a very skeptical, inquisitive kid, had a lot of questions. It was just an environment that the church didn't seem like a place where you could ask those, or people didn't have good answers. And so I walked away from the faith when I got into college, and it was actually a book I stumbled across that introduced me to apologetics, and I fell in love with it. And then because of that, it created a passion in me to explain why I believe what I believe to everybody, but doing it in a winsome and attractive manner. And so because of that, I saw the tremendous need for it in the church itself, that apologetics is extremely good at not only strengthening believers for our own beliefs and when going gets tough, but also winning our friends over, our friends that are non-believers. And so apologetics is very helpful in that. But I think one of the most important things that apologetics is very, very useful for is in shaping culture to see Christianity as an intellectually available option. And we actually have that opportunity the more we as Christians become informed about why we believe what we believe, and we're more informed about the objections for why people maybe aren't Christians and the answers to that. And so I'm so passionate about being at a church, Community Life Church. I've been here for about 2.5 years now, and just being a part of a church that not only is open to these questions, but welcomes the scrutiny of those who are skeptical to our faith is just awesome. It's not something you see in our culture as normally, and so just to kind of see that tide turning with churches that are open to that is so good. So thankful for Zach to come in to a place like this, like Joe said, a den of lambs, to discuss these issues with us is it's so great to see that, while we may be worlds apart when it comes to the way we look at ultimate reality, at the end of the day, we're both human beings. And, I could probably go out to dinner with Zach and create a friendship with him. And just to see that is something that's also tremendously valuable. And so often churches avoid these types of questions. So thankful that Sea Life is just a breath of fresh air in this environment that we're about to talk about tonight. So why am I here? So I'm the moderator, like Joe said. I'm here to provide bumpers. So for the debate, I want to make it as fair as possible. So if it seems rude, if I'm cutting somebody off, it's because I'm making sure both speakers are staying within the time frame that's allotted. So with that being said, I actually want to introduce you guys to Zachary Moore so you know a little bit more about him. So I'm gonna read this really quickly. It's a little bit about him. So Zachary Moore was raised in a Christian home. He was influenced primarily by Reformed theology. Biblical literacy was emphasized during his childhood and adolescence and throughout the course of his young life. He managed to read the Bible from cover to cover nearly a dozen times. That's impressive, actually. I don't know if I've done that. During his early adulthood, Zach was exposed to the paradigm of biblical literary analysis and began a period of self-reflection and self-criticism, which ended in his apostasy, his walking away from the faith. Since that time, Zach has become active in the free thought and humanist communities, helping to found and organize the Fellowship of Free Thought of Dallas, as well as Camp Quest, Texas, and Dallas-Fort Worth Coalition of Reason. He also has hosted and produced the Evolution 101 and Apologia podcasts. And now I'm going to read a quick bio on Dr. Joe Paris. Most of us probably know him personally, but just for the formality, Dr. Joe Paris is a passionate communicator that is committed to helping believers know what they believe and why they believe it. He is committed to teaching complex principles in a manner that is relevant to the audience. Joe recognizes that culture is having a drastic impact on the way young people view the world. Joe is committed to helping people see the world in light of Scripture. Joe spent 13 years as a Christian school educator, which allowed him to observe and combat the influence of various dominant worldviews. In 2015, he received the Educator of the Year award from Peoria Christian School. And in 2014, Joe completed his Doctorate of Ministry degree from Southern Evangelical Seminary, where his dissertation focused on creating a simple and systematic approach to proving the deity of Jesus Christ. Joe is married to his lovely wife. They have two beautiful daughters, Lola, 4, and Harper, 2. Which is that accurate?
It's 5.
It's actually, yeah. I was thinking it was 5 now. Joe currently lives in Forney, Texas. So with that, I want to welcome both of our speakers to give a brief personal introduction for why they believe what they believe about Christianity, and we'll start with Zach.
Appreciate
appreciate that very much, William and Joe. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for you all for showing up here. Once upon a time, I was very much like most of you. Once upon a time, I would have been sitting right here in the front row probably if I'd heard about this event and wanted to come and see what this is all about. This sort of thing really fascinated me when I was a Christian. The Bible fascinated me when I was a Christian. And the Bible is what I'm going to be talking most about here tonight. All of my points I'm going to be making are undergirded by things that you can look up in your very own Bibles, which I'm sure you've all brought with you here tonight. But really, and if we could advance a couple of slides. Yeah, so the reason why I'm here is to tell you the story of a man. Now, this is a very important man in my life, and I hope in yours as well. This man existed before time began. Through him, the world itself was created. He was sent down into the world by the Father to bring wisdom and truth to the world of man. He did not seek to establish a kingdom for himself, but to show men the way. He undertook his ministry, journeying and teaching and working wonders. He was eventually rejected and tortured by the authorities of his age, and he willingly sacrificed himself to save the world of man. Eventually, he died and was resurrected in the power and glory, and I hope that you all know about the story of this man. If we could, the story, of course, of Gandalf the Grey from the Lord of the Rings. Tonight I'm going to be talking about stories, and I wanted to bring this story up right at the beginning just to sort of put you all in the right frame of mind to be thinking about what it is that I want to share with you, because I sort of took the frame of this debate, fact or fiction. And for most of us, when we think fact or fiction, we think true and false. But there's another way to take that. Fact and fiction is perhaps history or story. And I quite like fictional stories. They're very often meaningful to me, and I think they are probably very meaningful to many of you. And so I'm going to be analyzing the gospel story, the resurrection account, within that context here tonight, in the context of a story. And I hope that you all can share within that story and maybe learn a little bit more about my story as we go along.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Zach, for being here. And I'm already feeling like this is going to be an illustration sometime in a future sermon for me, like the time that I had a great idea. Just to kind of give you a quick background, some of you know my story, some of you, this will be brand new, but I grew up in a Christian home very similar to Zach, very reformed in its thinking and just very heavy on biblical literacy, studying the Bible. My parents were saved when I was young, and so they were kind of gung-ho about church, and so we were always in church. It seemed we were there Sunday morning, Sunday evenings, Wednesdays for Awanas, Thursday afternoons if we had nothing else to do. Like, we were just always in the church, and so I always assumed that Christianity was true. I had never met an atheist. I had never met somebody really who had a different worldview, and so I assumed there were Christians and there were non-Christians, but non-Christians were non-Christians because they just didn't know about Christianity, and so it was our job to go tell them, and until we told them, they couldn't become Christians. And so I grew up with a very simplistic view of atheism and other worldviews. And I remember when I was a junior in college, my faith started to become my own, and I started to really take stock of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And interesting enough, several months into that, I met my first atheist. And not only did I meet my first atheist, but this person was very intelligent. They were very articulate, and they started to ask me a lot of questions about what I believed and why I believed it. I remember for some people, they can have those questions and they can be fine with that, but I was not fine with that. I could not process in my head. I kept thinking to myself, if what my atheist friend said is true, then everything that my pastor says is false. And so I went into a season of really questioning and asking some doubts. And one of the questions that really hung in the back of my head was the idea, if the church has had me for 20 years, how is it possible that an atheist could take apart my faith in 20 minutes? And at that point, I realized that something had to be done about my life and something had to be done with the way that we were approaching faith in the 21st century. And so this took me on a journey to not only find out what I believed and why I believed it, but to really help others shape their beliefs and to have a defense for why they believe what they believe. Let me just give you some quick statistic what motivates me. Research tells us now that about 75% of Christian young people leave the faith when they turn 18. That 75% of Christian kids, when they go off to university, they walk away from the faith. They tell us that there are three main reasons why they do this: emotional reasons, volitional reasons, and intellectual reasons. Intellectual reasons that people did not answer the questions that they had. 32% of those kids who were walked away from the faith, 32% of them said, nobody answered my questions. And I remember seeing that statistic and thinking to myself, if 32% of Christian kids are saying that nobody answered their questions, what if we got ahead of this? What if we started to have discussions and debates? What if we started to have classes where we didn't just talk about the Bible, but we talk about why we knew the Bible was true, or talked about why we knew that God existed, and really started to develop an apologetic approach? And I was teaching at a school up in Illinois, and at first they were a little bit hesitant, just like I was a little bit hesitant to do something like this tonight because it's scary. Because there's, at some point in the middle of this, you're kind of going, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what Zach's going to say. I've prepared the best I can, but there's a sense of there could be a moment where we're kind of going, I did not anticipate that. And I remember I was sitting in my classroom with a student, and I was sharing the vision for how I wanted to shape our school and how I wanted to shape our curriculum. And this student, her name was Cora, and Cora started crying, and I don't do well with girls that cry, and so I quickly tried to get her to stop crying, and she started to tell me her story that her brothers and sisters, she had 3 older siblings that went off to the University of Texas in Austin. And she told me how they had left their faith because they were asked some really tough questions and they jettisoned the Christian faith. And I remember sitting there with her, telling her that maybe her story could be a little bit different if we prepared her for that moment. Research tells us that students who are prepared ahead of time are least likely to believe the alternative. And so I took this as the cornerstone for my approach to say, what if we got ahead of this? Now, I wish I could tell you that all these stories worked out this well. I wish I could tell you that all of my students that have gone through my class have remained Christians and they've remained in their Christian worldview, but the truth is that hasn't been the case. My last year that I was teaching this, I had a student, it was probably my best student. Her name was Mo Pasteris, and she was taking this class as an upperclassman. She was taking it as an elective. This was of her own volition. She was one of my best students. She was reading far beyond what I was asking the students to read. She was engaging the class far more than any other student. But I noticed over a series of weeks that turned into months that her demeanor changed. And I remember it was February, and we were talking in my classroom, and she said, I don't know if you've noticed over the last couple of months, but I've been a little bit different. And honestly, I just chalked it up to her being, a high school girl, that she was just going through something as far as sports or boys or just something in her life. And she said, you asked some really tough questions in the midst of class, and in the midst of class, I became an atheist. And I remember sitting there thinking, I am the worst teacher in the world at this Christian school. Like, my best student has just left the faith. What have I done? I remember that night I went home, and I really started to think about what I was doing and if the approach I was a really good approach. Maybe it was better that we just stay cocooned. Maybe we just kept ourselves away from other worldviews and other religions and other atheists, and we just said, this is what we believe, and we're just going to keep it personal inside of ourselves. But then I feel like God gave me kind of this thought. He kind of allowed this question to pop in my head, and it was this idea that the questions that I asked weren't questions that I created. They were questions that were out there, and she was going to come across these questions at some point in her journey. Was it better for her to wrestle with these questions all by herself, or was it better for her in a classroom with a teacher who was trained, in a school and environment that cared for her? Was it better for her to wrestle with these questions? And I came to the conclusion that it was better for her to wrestle with a group of people around her. This is very nervous for me tonight. There are 300 plus people in here tonight who could have been celebrating Maundy, Thursday, all by themselves, not having to wrestle with some deep existential, philosophical, historical questions. And yet you're here tonight, and I think that's good. I think we're going to be stronger tonight. I believe that you will walk away tonight, and Zach will make you think. I believe many of you will email me tomorrow like, hey, what was the real answer to that question? I just think that's going to happen. But here's the thing. What I would tell you is that that's part of the journey, that's part of the process, and that's going to make us stronger. I want to close with this. Some people say that a lot of Christians are being talked out of their faith, that 75% of these Christian kids are being talked out of their faith. And I would challenge that, and I would say, I believe many of us have never been talked into our faith. And hopefully tonight I want to talk you into your faith. I want to give you reasons to believe and hold to the resurrection. And if Zach would just be quiet the whole time, I believe I can do a great job of that. So,
If I could, Joe, I
Yeah.
just want to underline something that you pointed out there. And I also want to speak directly to everyone here. I presume there's many people here from your church, most of them. You need to do the hard work of lifting up Joe, because he is not lying
Amen,
when he
ma'am. Keep
says
going with that, yeah.
that this was a hard thing for him to do. And it was a hard thing for him to do for a number of reasons. Number one, these questions are tough questions. They are. I mean, that's just the truth of it. These are tough questions. It's so much easier to just ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is there are no other pastors that he can look to as models for how to engage with these questions with their congregations. I should know, because I've been looking. I've been all over this metroplex. I've been looking all over, even in this country, trying to find churches that are doing what Joe is doing here tonight, and he is one of the first. He should be celebrated for that. This is the thing that the church has avoided for too long. I am not here tonight, and Joe's already mentioned this, but I want to underline it. I'm not here tonight to convert any of you. If you all go home with the same beliefs that you came here with, I'm just fine. All I need to do, quite frankly, this is frank talk here, all I need to do in order for there to be more atheists in the world is to just stay at home and watch TV. Because there are more and more and more, mostly young people that are leaving the faith. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to press any argument. I don't have to show up here. The reason why I'm here is because these questions are important to discuss. And in my opinion, the church is still the best equipped institution to deal with them. And that is why I'm here. And thank you, Joe.
No, thank you.
Thank you for that, Zach. So with that, we're going to start with our point by points. Just as a refresher, each point and rebuttal point is going to be 2 minutes. And so Joe is going to start with the first point. Zachary is going to present his point, and then Joe is going to do his first rebuttal. And that is going to be the pattern of the debate
And
tonight.
a 30-second just warning, hey, you got 30 seconds left.
Yeah, we'll do a 30-second warning just
Fair
to
enough.
be fair. And I won't try to be too rude when I cut you guys off. So with that being said, Joe, you are ready to start
Yeah.
when you want.
Yeah, good. Well, my first point, and what I wanted to show you was that I'm going to give you 5 points for why I think the resurrection is a historical event. It's going to make up the acronym RISEN, and it's reliable historian. It's missing, referring to the body of Jesus Christ. Severe change in disciples, the early creeds, and the numerous eyewitnesses. I believe that these 5 points will make a solid case for why we can leave here and say it is a historical fact that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. I think the New Testament writers are a reliable source, but I don't think we need to use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or even Paul to build the case for the resurrection. You can make the case from extra biblical sources. So these would be people that were not believers in Jesus Christ. These would be just historians that we would take from any other work from antiquity to make our case, like Herodotus or Julius Caesar or the Iliad or Homer, anything like that. So we have men like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Marabar, Serapion, Thales, Pliny the Younger, Pliny the Elder. There are actually 11 extra biblical sources that talk about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So for sake of time, I want to just read real quickly the works of Josephus, who would have been one of the earliest ones, who was sympathetic to Christianity but was not a known Christian to us. He says this in his writing of Antiquities. He says, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good. He was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had
30
become
seconds.
his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to him after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had wondered about." There's another quote here from Tacitus that talks about the Christians and the Christus. And then there's also a quote from Thales that was quoted through Julius of Africanus, talking about the events of the resurrection and the darkness that fell over the land. I think from just extra biblical sources, we can make a historical case
Time.
for the resurrection.
Really?
2 minutes is really
We
fast.
might not have enough time for these.
No, seriously.
Take a big
maybe we
breath
should
and
give
just say it all in one
5
sentence.
minutes.
One
Yeah.
run on.
Let's bump it to 3.
Yeah.
3 minutes?
3.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
So Josephus, Tacitus, some of these historians were mentioned. Josephus, very famously, the passage in the history, or the antiquities of the Jews, I should say, that is widely controversial, mostly because Josephus gained his stature in the Roman court by proclaiming Titus as the Messiah, as the Jewish Messiah. He proclaimed Titus as the Jewish Messiah. It makes absolutely no sense for him to say in his official history that Titus would have read that, no, Jesus was the Messiah. So it makes absolutely no historical sense for that to be the case. A lot of scholars think that this was actually an interpolation, potentially by Eusebius or some other Christian. As for the other historians, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, none of these actually provide firsthand accounts of Jesus' life. They're just relying on stories that Christians at the time were telling them. So all of these historians, and they all were actually friends with each other, strangely enough, lived in the early 2nd century and were encountering Christians at the time, but this is 100 years after Jesus supposedly lived, and they are telling them stories about what they believe, and that's really all that their records are relaying, unfortunately. Now, what Tacitus and Suetonius both note is the Neronic persecution, which may have been, it's difficult to say. There certainly was a problem during the rule of Nero. There was, according to their accounts, Nero blamed Christians in Rome for problems that were potentially the fire that was caused there, and there was some persecution. But again, simply because they were Christians in Rome, all that tells you is that there were people that happened to believe in Jesus. It doesn't give you actual firsthand information as to the life of Jesus.
Good.
Very punctual. You were under 2 minutes.
All right.
Good job.
Okay, Joe.
Okay.
First rebuttal.
Yeah, so what I would say to this, and I don't know if you noticed
Was that
this.
my point, or was that my rebuttal?
That was actually,
That was
sound like
actually
your
your
rebuttal.
point.
But you can,
I meant that to be my rebuttal.
Yes.
So yeah,
Sorry.
that's
so go to your point now.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead and do your point.
My apologies. If you could forward to the story is constructed. There we go. So if you go ahead one more. If you could all open your Bibles with me to Mark chapter 16. Those of you who have been particularly astute biblical students have noticed that there is an interesting little footnote in that chapter which says that verses 9 through 20 of Mark chapter 16 are not actually included in many of the original manuscripts. Has anybody noticed that? That's one thing that I noticed. Now, a lot of the footnotes in the translations will say that some of the earliest manuscripts do not include. Actually, that's not the full truth. None of the earliest manuscripts include verses 9 through 20. What are verses 9 through 20? Verses 9 through 20 are the entire resurrection story encapsulated in Mark, which is to say that when Mark was first written, there was no resurrection account. So we're talking about the resurrection as a story. From the very beginning, Mark did not include a resurrection. There was the empty tomb, but there was no resurrection experience of Jesus. The women came, they saw the empty tomb, they saw the young man, who's probably an angel, and they ran away afraid, and Mark says they told no one. And that's where the earliest version ends, with the women running away and telling no one. That doesn't make for a very good resurrection account, does it? Right? So that's probably why somebody came later and added verses 9 through 20. And what do we find in 9 through 20? We find some pretty amazing stuff. We find the claim that Christians will be able to withstand poison and venomous serpents. And that's why we have these types of religious churches, primarily in the Appalachian regions, where people actually handle venomous serpents and sometimes die from them, because that's what happens. But sometimes they drink strychnine too, because the verses in Mark say that they can. Right? So that's where these things come from, because the stories were put together. They were put together very much like a nicely tailored jacket, but when you look really closely, you can see some of the seams. You can see some of the loose threads, and that's one of them. Another one is, if you advance one more, in the Gospel of John. Now, when you think of Jesus, like the classic story of Jesus, what do you think? Everyone's already thought of the story where he forgives the adulterous woman, right? It's supposed to be Mary Magdalene. That is the classic Jesus story. Even in the Passion of the Christ, which didn't include any gospel stories, included that.
30 seconds.
Because it was so important. Guess what? That is also not in the earliest manuscripts of John. That is some story that was made up after the fact and added in probably in the 5th and 6th century. The earliest we can find it is in Codex Beziae, that was from that time. So this is another constructed story, and we know this to be the case. You can look again in your Gospel of John, you will see a footnote to that effect. So the point of it is that we know that the Gospels were constructed in a manner that allowed believers to pick and choose, subtract, and add to their stories to suit their own theological needs.
That's good. Hey, I like the new format. Let's stick with this where he can rebuttal right after. I think that's good. So I agree with you on the Mark passage, and I think you know this, that almost every Greek scholar out there would agree with you on that.
Oh, yeah.
The sad thing is, Dan Wallace, when he was asked about this, why we keep putting this in the New Testament, his answer was most of the people of the church don't know how the Bible was compiled, and so it would shatter their faith. So honestly, I would think it would do us much better to take it out. We know it's not in the earliest manuscripts, obviously just by the language and the literature and the fact that it does have this weird story about being bitten by snakes and living. It doesn't even fit with the pattern of the New Testament. I see where you're going with this, with, Mark predates Matthew most likely, and Luke and John. But I think we can get even earlier than Mark, though, with Paul's account, with, Corinthians and his salvation story, but even the early creeds. And so even though I think Mark doesn't necessarily mention the resurrection, although he does mention the empty tomb, it's kind of like they're leading up to it. I don't think that this would throw it out. I do love the story of the woman caught in adultery. I would agree with you once again. I don't think that should be in there. Every Greek historian, even Greek scholar, would agree with you on that. However, I do think you can make the case that that it probably was a true story. It probably was passed down orally. What I like to think happened with this story was that it was passed down from generation to generation. Somewhere in the 5th century, a scholar said, I really like this story, and they put it in there. The problem is, and you know this, that one of the rules for New Testament manuscripts was you couldn't add or take away. And so once it gets in there, it's in there because I don't want to be the guy that takes it out.
Well, exactly.
I mean, there's possible punishment by, Revelation says anybody who adds
Some
or
people
takes
think
away.
it might come from the Gospel of the Hebrews.
Yeah, and but I would also say this though too, is if we lose Mark 16:9 through 20, and especially if we lose John 7:53 8 through 11, I don't think it changes the story of the resurrection, nor do I think it changes the story of Jesus Christ. I think we would be better to take it out. Because I don't think it adds or takes away, but I think because we don't have more conversations like this, they continue to keep it in there. So,
Is that the final of your rebuttal?
Yeah,
You had extra time. Okay, so just for clarity for everybody out there, so we're switching it up just a little bit. Joe is going to present his second point, and then Zach is going to get an opportunity to rebuttal. We're going to do 3 minutes instead of 2. And then after Zachary does his rebuttal, he is then going to go into his second point, and then Joe is going to follow up with a rebuttal. So with that being said, Joe, your second point.
yeah. So I would say my, where are we at? Oh, that must have, okay, there we go. I would say my second argument for why I think the resurrection is a work of history is that the body is missing. The body of Jesus is missing, and this is quite problematic. The Christian view is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, taking his body with him. In order to say that the resurrection did not occur, Zachary needs to give an explanation for the whereabouts of the body of Jesus. The fact that history can't account for the body of Jesus makes a strong case for the resurrection. Several popular views have been reported over time. Ideas like the swoon theory, that Jesus wasn't really dead, that he came back to life in the tomb, resuscitated by the cold and just being by himself. Some theorists say that the disciples stole the body. Some say that the Romans stole the body. There's actually a theory that grew from the 19th century that Jesus had a twin brother that actually took his place. There are some that have purported that maybe that they got lost and they didn't know where the tomb was, that they were so overwhelmed with grief and emotion that they went to the wrong tomb and they were so excited. And then I think that my explanation would be the resurrection. I want to real quickly just go through these alternative opinions and just tell you why I think they fall apart. The swoon theory, I think, is really unlikely that Jesus survived, escaped, and then somehow came back and convinced his disciples that he was really resurrected. I think that it would take a lot more than that to convince them. I don't think it's popular to believe that the disciples stole the body. First question you have to ask is, how did they do this? The second question is, why would they do this? And then the third question, would they really die for a lie? Watergate had 7 people that were involved in that controversy, and it fell apart within 2 weeks. And yet 2,000 years later, the disciples to believe that they had this massive cover-up that they were able to take to the grave is possible, but I really don't think that it's plausible or probable. I don't think that the Romans would have stole the body. First off, why would they do that? It hurts their cause, it hurts their reputation. And what we know historically is that Pilate wanted to keep peace and quiet in the area, and this was the last thing that would do that. I don't think Jesus had a twin brother, because it still doesn't account for the body, and the unknown tomb falls apart because the family knew where the tomb was, the disciples, the Romans, Joseph of Arimathea knew where the tomb was, the Pharisees knew where the tomb was, and I think really, if you look back historically, it was only a 10-minute walk to get from the gravesite to downtown Jerusalem, so I don't think it would have been hard for somebody to blow this wide open. Therefore, I think the resurrection is the most plausible case for the missing body.
Okay,
Sure.
Zachary, rebuttal?
Sure, yeah. And so rebutting to this sort of requires you to sort of step inside the story and assume that what is being relayed in the accounts is actually historical. But even if we do that, one of the things that the gospel accounts and actually the apostles are consistent about is that after the crucifixion of Jesus, the apostles were in hiding for quite a long time. In fact, the very first public event that the apostles participated in to really sort of come out as a new movement was, what was it? Pentecost. What does Pentecost mean? Pentecost means 50 days later. So that means that the very first time that anybody knew about this new movement, if we go inside the story, is 50 days after a man died. 50 days after a man died in first century Palestine after being stuck inside a little cave. I can tell you, after 50 days, I don't know if you've heard of the Body Farm over in Tennessee where they do these sorts of studies. After 50 days, most of everything is liquidized and nothing is recognizable. So even if you'd had a body at that point, 50 days after, at Pentecost, when the apostles and the disciples started making their claims, and they could have been rebutted if a body had been found, even if you'd gotten Jesus' body, nobody would have known what it looked like. Now, the other point that Joe made of none of the disciples would have died for a lie, we don't actually know that they did. There's quite a lot of church tradition that suggests that the disciples died for their faith, but we don't actually know any of that to be true. There's no records of any of that. The closest we can get is a mention, I think, that Clement makes of Peter and Paul, that says that in sort of vague terms that they were either persecuted or they were tested for their beliefs. I don't know what that means. We don't actually have any evidence to suggest that every single one. There's loads of really fascinating stories. If you're interested in the extra-canonical literature, there's loads of fascinating stories about all these disciples being tortured every which way, but no historical evidence of that is actually the case.
Okay, Zach, your second point.
Sure. So if we could go ahead to the confused one.
This one?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
okay.
One more, if you would. So this is from The Last Temptation of Christ. This is actually one of my favorite movies to watch on Easter weekend. And I don't mean it to be sacrilegious. I know that it is a somewhat blasphemous take on Jesus, but the human Jesus that it presents is so fascinating. I cannot stop from watching it. And every year I watch it, and every year at the end of the movie I'm in tears because Jesus has accomplished what he set out to do. But therein lies the question. So in this movie, Jesus says at the very end, it is accomplished. If you would turn with me in your Bibles again to the ends of all the different Gospels where Jesus actually dies, one thing that some of you may have noticed is that the words are different. The last words of Jesus on the cross are different when you look at the different Gospels. Why is that? In Matthew and Mark, he says in pretty much the same way, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. In John, he says, it is finished, or it is accomplished. Now, Matthew and Mark are both referencing, probably, most likely, Psalm 22, which is a psalm of lamentation of David, where he is sort of bemoaning all these people that have beset him and are torturing him and giving him a hard time. And a lot of the things that are happening to the character in the psalm are happening to Jesus throughout. And this is a very well-known thing. It's so well-known, in fact, that we could say that maybe the person who wrote that story, maybe Mark, whoever wrote Mark, actually used those elements in the same way that Gandalf and Jesus share elements. The psalm and Jesus share elements. They share the mockery, they share the dividing clothes and casting lots, that's from Psalms, and they share the piercing. So somebody who had read Psalm 22 and wanted to paint a beautiful picture of suffering would have used that. And so using that reference underlies that. Now Luke references one of the lines of Psalm 31, which is similar to Psalm 22, but it's different in the sense that it's not quite so bemoaning his fate, right? So, why have you forsaken me? Luke doesn't say that. He makes Jesus out to be a more intentional, sacrificial person, right? And so, by changing that line, you change the theology. And John even goes further. John just says in one word, and we can't, since it's just one word, we can't really pin it to Scripture. It's
30
accomplished.
seconds.
But in John, Jesus is so far above it, he doesn't even complain. He asks for a drink at the end and tosses it back and says, okay, I'm done. That's how easy it was for Jesus in John. And so what you can do is you can then look at how those different scriptures are played out and see how the theology that underlies those choices really informs how those stories were constructed. If we jump right real quick, this is also the case
Time.
Sorry, I won't be able to get to this, but this is also the reason why Mary is crying in John and not in other Gospels.
Okay, Joe, your second rebuttal.
So I want to make sure that I don't attack straw men here. So if we were to summarize your argument on this one, it would be the different accounts through Mark and Luke and John, and that there doesn't seem to be consistency. That's probably a poor choice of terms. But
Yeah. So the last words are different.
different. Okay, so I think, one of the things that we as historians, whenever we're piecing together works from antiquity, obviously you want to see consistency, but there's also something that makes us nervous is when we do see ultimate 100% consistency, you have to assume collusion, that they got together and that they worked together to create. So, for example, this as a police officer, as they're talking to eyewitnesses, if they agree on every single point, at some point that throws up a red flag because everybody sees things differently. Not to say that things are differently, but we have different shared experiences. For example, I've never been in a car accident, and so for me to describe a car accident would be probably very factual. For somebody who had been in a car accident, it would be probably more personal, more emotional, and so they may talk about the screeches and the sounds and the horrificness, and I may say it was a blue car, it hit a red car, that's what happened. And so I think when we look at Mark and Luke and John, even though they make different references to Old Testament, even though they describe it differently, even though they use different wording, I think that actually makes a stronger case for the historicity of their story rather than a weaker case. I believe it was, I'm blanking on the historian, but there was a historian in the early 20th century from Harvard who was studying this. I think it was, can you help me with this, Will? I'm blanking on the name. Is it?
Sorry.
Okay. I'm just going to have to take my word on this. But he was actually overwhelmed by the evidence for this. It was a Harvard professor, and his name is blanking. And do you know it, Zach? Can you think of it?
There's a lot of Harvard
Come on, help me out,
professors
man.
out
Come
there.
on,
Sorry.
seriously. Throw me a bone here.
I'll tell you if I
But
do it.
the idea, he talks about that in his story, that because of the differences, that was actually more convincing for him than to take away from that. So I think we should expect a little bit of differences. They were three individuals who were writing from their own personal perspective. I don't think the fact that their word usage is contrary to one another, I think it's actually complementary to one another. So.
Well, and just so that my point is not merely that they're contradictory. My point is that the way that they change the last words of Christ are consistent with the other theological changes that they make in their Gospels.
Yes.
If we do make points back and forth, I will pause
Sure.
for whoever is making the point on the other person's time for fairness.
Sure.
Do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I don't know if I would say anything terribly different. I think all the gospel writers, and even those looking back on the gospel writers, real that Matthew had an agenda, Luke had an agenda, John had an agenda. Some were writing to Gentiles, some were writing to Jews, and so I think we would expect to see that, and that's fine. And I think even if we were to somehow resurrect them and ask them, they'd be like, yeah, that was completely my agenda. I was trying to make it sound more historical, messianical, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Now, Joe, you are on your third point.
Yes. So my third point would be that the reason I think that the resurrection is a historical fact is that we see a severe change in the disciples. This third argument, 95% of historians, Christian and non-Christian, believe that there was a drastic change in the disciples. This seems to be a historical fact for many of us. The followers of Jesus seem to make the most drastic change in the story. At first, the disciples are confident that Jesus Christ is Lord. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus asked a question to his disciples, to which he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" To which Peter replied, "You are the Christ." Peter is so convinced of this that he is actually willing to give Malchus an earful, or maybe an ear less, But then Jesus goes to the cross. He dies a gruesome death by crucifixion, and he's buried. History tells us that the disciples disperse. They leave the area. Interesting enough, Peter's the only one left, but eventually he realizes the pressure is mounting, and he abandons Jesus. The disciples believed. They saw the crucifixion, and then they abandoned Jesus. Yet we know that all the disciples die a martyr's death, although I would agree with what Zach said previously, that we are not 100% sure on all of the disciples dying a martyr's death. I think that's a historical thing that has added some legend over the time. But what we do know to be historically true is that Peter, Paul, James, son of Zebedee, and James, the brother of Jesus, did die from predominantly Clement's work. We know that Peter was crucified upside down. Paul was beheaded. We get that from Eusebius. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded also. And James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death. But here's what I would say my main point would be that I think the book of Acts makes it very clear not only that the disciples were willing to die for this. And so we have to ask the question, why did they have such a drastic change? Why did they go from believers to unbelievers to people that were willing to die? And I think you can make a very credible case from the book of Acts that they were all willing to die, and a historical fact that these 4 people did die believing that Jesus Christ was resurrected.
All right, Zach, your rebuttal.
Yeah, so here I'll sort of do a half rebuttal. So I'll just reiterate the point that I made before, that for the vast majority of the disciples, we hear these stories from non-canonical gospels. So these are stories written that are not accepted as inspired works. So we should treat them as tradition, if anything. And as you mentioned from Eusebius is coming from the 4th century, so this is 400 years after the fact, for what that's worth. I will say, though, that when it comes to Paul, right, so Paul's story does appear to be the real deal, right? And we get this not really from Acts, which I have some problems with, as I think it's mostly a literary work, but from Paul's own writing. So if you read in the first couple of chapters of Galatians, Paul tells his own story, and what he tells is similar to what happens in Acts, but clearly he has gone through some sort of a transformation. Clearly he regarded himself as an enemy of Christianity who then had some experience. He had some vision of the risen Christ. What was that? We don't actually know. Now, the only description of that we have to go on is in Acts, and in Acts, we find that he didn't actually see the risen Christ in the same way that the disciples did. He saw a bright light shining in the sky. Now, what's interesting is, and you've already mentioned the creed in 1 Corinthians, Paul lumps himself in with that creed. So there's these appearances that Jesus made to all these different people that Paul sort of lists out in 1 Corinthians. And last of all, as to one untimely born, myself, he includes himself in that. But from Acts, what we know from what Paul saw is just a light in the sky. So does that mean that that's how Jesus appeared to everybody else, is just a bright light in the sky? We don't know exactly. That's how Constantine reported it. That's how loads of other believers reported it. Is it the case that the earliest disciples saw Jesus as a light in the sky? Perhaps. If we are to take Paul at his word, and as he lumps his own experience in with the other disciples, the other apostles, he does not experience a bodily resurrected Christ. And if his experience is normative, which he seems to indicate that it is, then perhaps there was no bodily resurrection of Christ that the disciples experienced. And again, Galatians, these letters of Paul predate, as you've already mentioned, predate the Gospels. This is the earliest layer of Christian text. It's something to think about.
Okay, Zach, this is your opportunity to make a third point.
Sure. So if you jump ahead to the conjecture,
Yes.
and then go one past. So one of the things that we see often, over and over, quite frankly, in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel according to John, is this phrase, according to the Scriptures. So what does that mean? Well, our typical interpretation of that is that these things happened and they were orchestrated in some way cosmically by God so that Jesus' life fulfilled these Scriptures, right? But let's step back for a second, right? We know that all these prophecies existed long before the Christian movement existed. We know that the early Christian writers had access to the Old Testament. They were reading the Old Testament. They were searching the Old Testament. Acts tells us about the early disciples searching through the scriptures for references to Jesus. What if by doing so they found these little bits of scripture and said, you know what? That should be a Jesus story, right? And we see loads of these stories that parallel Jesus' story in the Gospels. We find them in the Old Testament, particularly in the stories that are attributed to Elijah and Elisha, right? So there's this story where Elisha, right? So we know about the feeding of the 500, where Jesus receives the loaves and the fish, and he hands them out to 500 people, or 5,000, I'm sorry. There's a very similar story in 2 Kings, where Elisha does the exact same thing, only with bread. Now, why is it, I'm just wondering, why is it that fish are added in with Jesus? Well, it turns out there's another story that is very similar between Jesus and another teacher early in that era, Pythagoras. And Pythagoras goes along and he finds this fishing boat, and they're trying to catch fish, and they're not able to. And Pythagoras says, if you allow me to guess the number of the fish, will you let them go? And they say, sure. And he guesses the right number, they let them go. A very similar story to when Jesus, in John 21, this is the resurrected Jesus, helps fishermen catch a certain number of fish. This is a miraculous catch. If you look in John 21, it actually gives you the number of fish. Does anybody know the number? It's 153. Isn't that a weird number? Why 153? Well, it turns out one of the sacred numbers to the Pythagoreans was 153. If you take 153, the ratio of that to 265, you can draw a shape that is shaped kind of like this. And what is it called? The vesica piscis, the shape of the fish. And in the early illustrations of Jesus, we see Jesus framed in the vesica piscis. And if you turn that vesica piscis on its side
30 seconds.
and extend it a little bit further, what do you get? You get the ichthus, the Jesus fish. One more. This is another story that is pure conjecture. This is in Matthew 27, 51 through 54. You can look this up on your own. I call this the Walking Dead story. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who were fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went to the holy city and appeared to many. Let's not forget about a resurrection. Dead people walking around
Time.
Jerusalem. This is not included in any historical record. Why is that? I think it's just conjecture.
That's good.
All right, rebuttal.
So with regards to the Elijah and Elisha story, I would say that there does seem to be some parallels between these two, although I don't think necessarily parallels undermine or call into credibility the actual stories of Jesus. I think we see throughout history there are examples of times that stories follow the same parallels and pattern lines. So for example, several years before the Titanic crash, the largest ship was the Titan. And so you could look at that and say, well, the Titanic was a made-up story because there was a story that predated that had the same lines. It was the largest ship. It was called the Unsinkable Ship, and it sunk, therefore the Titanic. But I think we know just by history that that would not necessarily throw out. I think you could also look back and say there was once a flying object that flew into the tallest building in New York City. Most of us would think that was 9/11. It was actually the Hindenburg. Both storylines are parallel to one another, but I don't think that calls into question. Even though I do recognize that there are similar storylines, I don't think that undermines the truthfulness of the gospel accounts. I do think it causes us to pause and think about maybe some of the parallels, but I don't think that it undermines the truthfulness of that. The Matthew 27, I think that's a really interesting point that most theologians are talking about now, and even Mike Licona of Houston Baptist University has really called that into question. Not to say that it impugns inerrancy, but maybe it's more of an allusion to some of the things that are going on. So I think some really good work is being done on that. I don't know if Christian apologists have a good answer for that yet, but I would say that we're working on it, and we'll get back to you.
Norman Geisler has an answer.
Yeah, he does. yeah. Storm and Norman took some people down with that one. So, but I do think that there's some things that we do need to wrestle with on that passage to figure out what Matthew was trying to convey. Although I do not think that it would be appropriate to throw the baby out with the bathwater to say we don't quite understand what Matthew's intent was. I do think that it is a question, but I think it's one that we're working on. So.
Sure.
Okay, your fourth point, Joe.
So argument number 4 I would make is for the resurrection is that we have early creeds and testimonies about Jesus, And Zach, you brought up some of the dating and actually some of the questions about the resurrection story in Mark, and I think this would be a good time to circle back to that. A popular objection to the resurrection is that it was stuff of legends. It was a fish story that grew over time. Jesus was a moral and a charismatic figure who grew up in popularity over time. And actually, when Constantine decided to make Christianity the religion of Rome, he told the writers to spruce it up a little, make Jesus more godlike, hence the resurrection from the dead. The problem with this is that creeds and testimonies are way too early for the legend story. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8 says this, "For what I received, I also passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles, and last also he appeared to me as one who is abnormally born." And so I think we can make a couple of things that make this a reliable text. 1 Corinthians was probably written somewhere around 54, 55 AD, so we're within 25 years of the resurrection. I think that's notable, although I do not think that's right on top of it. I do think that some of the wordage and the verbiage that Paul uses is very interesting. He talks about delivering and receiving. Paul talks a lot about imparting tradition, and even he makes mention in this passage that most of them who are still living, which I think he was trying to allude to, is that, hey, these are eyewitnesses, you can go talk to them. But really what most historians, Christian and non-Christian, would agree that this is probably an early creed that dates back to within 3 years, maybe even a couple months of the event. It circulated early, it circulated in Jerusalem, and it seemed to grow widely during this time. I think when we also talk about some of the New Testament books, Mark, Matthew, Luke, we know that they were before, most likely before 70 AD. We don't know about John. That was probably much later. But we know that Mark is before Matthew, Matthew is before Luke, and Luke is most likely before Acts because Acts is before 70 AD. And so I still think that puts us very close to the original event where we could still talk to eyewitnesses. We could still have consistent theories. One of the things that I've always found interesting is that even though we can call into question some of the extra biblical historical sources, I think that we still need to recognize that we don't have any work from antiquity that says these people are purporting this, they're propagating this lie, they're propagating this. I've always found it interesting that we don't have more people writing against these. It seems rather suspicious to me that, 2,000 years later, we start coming up with these ideas about the author wasn't Matthew or this person was written much later. I want to ask the question, why weren't some of these objections brought up much earlier by other historians if they really are objections?
Right on time. Okay, Zachary, rebuttal?
Sure, yeah. So with the timing of the Gospels, it's kind of tough because there is a wide range. And what you do find in the scholarship is that those who are evangelical Christian scholars tend to want to date them much earlier. And why? Precisely because of the argument that Joe just made. The earlier you can date the Gospels, the more confident you are in them. Non-Christian scholars don't necessarily date them that early. Most of them view Mark as being post-70 because of the little apocalypse in there they think is a reference to the Jewish War. The Jewish War, we can place that in history in 70 AD for sure. And so if Mark post-dates the Jewish War, which seems likely, then Matthew and Luke, which are derived from them, would come later. These are high scholarly debates. I don't know exactly. I mean, even if we put it right at 70, that's actually just a little bit shy of the average lifespan of first century Palestine. So even if it was being written at that point, we're still talking about one generation later after the early church, which, whether that increases your confidence or not, I don't know. Now, the point about the creed that I find interesting, so I already made the point that Paul includes himself in that creed, and his Jesus experience is nothing like what we read about in the Gospels. What we also don't read about in any of the Gospels are any of these other appearances, right? So if this is the earliest nugget of Christian literature, something as foundational and central as a creed, why is this not represented in any of the Gospels? Why do we not have the appearance to the 500? Why do we not have the appearance to James? Why do we not have all these other appearances that are mentioned in this creed? If this is such an important and central and foundational part of Christian literature, we don't have it. This is the only place we have it. And so it's led some scholars to suppose that this might actually be an interpolation from later in the development of Christianity, because what does a creed mean? You only develop a creed when you have a church that you have to unite around the creed. So it makes absolutely no sense to develop a creed in the early days of a religious movement. The Mormon church did not develop a creed within the first months of its movement. No religious movement develops creeds that early. They usually wait after the first generation, after the first people are dying off. They have to unify the people who are left over. So this seems to be something that is coming from much later in history.
Okay, Zach, your fourth point.
So the point about the story being common, and this is going to raise some hackles, because I know probably some people have seen references to Jesus being similar to other mythological figures at the time. There are some examples that are good, some examples that are not so good. If you jump ahead real quickly, I've picked what I think are actually the strongest candidates, right? So we know that there were other mythological figures at the time that had characteristics similar to Jesus, in a similar way that Gandalf had characteristics similar to Jesus. And this is one that was endemic in first century Palestine at the time of far before the Christian movement came about. This is Tammuz. Right? Tammuz was a consort of Ishtar. This was a Mesopotamian deity, very famous, very well known, and was worshipped by the Jews. Was worshipped by the Jews. How do we know this? Well, if you look in Ezekiel chapter 8, one of the complaints that Ezekiel makes is that the women were wailing for Tammuz at the city gates. And what does wailing for Tammuz mean? Well, Tammuz died and came back to life. He did that twice a year. And when did Tammuz die? Actually, yesterday. He would die every year on March 25th, which was the spring equinox in the Julian calendar. So this was a dying and resurrecting God figure in ancient Mesopotamia that we already know was worshipped by the ancient Jews. They knew about this sort of a thing. They knew about gods that died and came back to life. Jump ahead one more. This is Attis. This is another mythological figure. Now, this comes from the broader Greek Hellenic culture. All right, so Attis is kind of similar to Jesus, but not exactly. They're similar in the same way that Gandalf and Jesus are similar. So I'm not trying to make out like there's a copycat thing going on. That's definitely not the case. But Attis comes from, guess where? Phrygia. What's Phrygia right next to? Galatia, right? What's that first letter that Paul wrote? That one of that first earliest layers of Christian text is his letter to the Galatians, right? So this was a God that was worshipped right in the center of the early church. The early Christians were very familiar with him. This is also a figure that died and was resurrected on the spring equinox, just like, or very similar to how Jesus was. So what does this mean? What am I trying to say? I'm not trying to say that the Christians simply cut and pasted from existing mythological traditions, but these ideas were in the mixture. They were in the society at the time. The story of Jesus has elements that are very similar to elements of other mythological godmen that preceded it. These are definitely before Christianity. And so what does it mean? Well, it's possible that the gospel writers could have borrowed from some of these elements if they wanted to.
All right. Joe, this is your rebuttal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think obviously we want to try and stay away from the copycat. What would you put Attis at as far as the earliest inscription or story that we have for him? What would you date?
We know about him being worshipped in the 4th century BCE.
BCE. Okay. I think we have to be careful here. I think one of the things we notice, especially about this time period and especially about the Middle East, is that the idea of deities was very prevalent. The idea of a rising and dying deity was prevalent. But I wouldn't make the case that Jesus Christ was on the backs of these people, but we have to be careful that we don't find Jesus guilty by proxy to say that because we know that these other ones are false, that Jesus would have to be false. And so I think if we look in Acts chapter 5, it tells us about Theudas and Judas, who made claims that they were men of God and that they had supernatural abilities, and yet, as it says in Acts chapter 5, that their followers gathered up to them and they were dispersed. And it's this really cool story between between the high priest, and where he basically charges his Pharisees to say, listen, let's see what happens. Everybody else that has made these claims, the disciples have died off and they've fallen apart, and the mystery of this religion has died on its own. Theudas claimed to be somebody significant. His followers died. Judas claimed to be somebody significant. His followers fell apart. And yet, what I find interesting is that Jesus, the case for his deity, isn't built upon the storylines, but it's built upon kind of the change in the disciples, the empty tomb, the fact that he did things that these other men like Attis didn't do, Theudas didn't do, Judas didn't do, Tamu didn't do. And so I think when we start, even though you weren't going into a copycat argument, I do think that obviously it kind of parallels in there. But I think most of the copycat arguments fall apart on just lack of evidence. But I would be very careful to say that because they fall apart, the story and the evidence of Jesus falls apart. I do think it's interesting, but I don't think that we can cause Jesus to fall guilty because they fell guilty. So that's how I would respond to that.
Okay. Now, Joe, you are on your fifth point.
The last point that I would make here, so we've talked about the evidence for this, reliable historians, it's missing the body, severe change in the disciples, early creeds, and numerous eyewitnesses would be my fifth point. I'm going to lean on the New Testament, mainly the Gospels, and I want to be careful on this, and I want to make it very clear to Zach and to the audience. I'm not looking at the New Testament as inspired, as an inerrant, as an infallible, although I do believe those things to be true about the New Testament. For the sake of argument, I'm just looking at this as a historical, reliable document that puts us back near the time and the events. I'm using the New Testament as a historical, reliable document. We can obviously discuss that and debate that for a later time if you want to do this again. I don't. So you can find somebody else, I'll help you with that. The New Testament has been found accurate in matters of history. So when we use the gospel in the book of Acts, here are some of the facts that we know just historically. 1 Corinthians puts the appearance of Jesus to 500 eyewitnesses over a period of 40 days. The Gospels tells us that Jesus appeared to the disciples. But what I find most interesting about this is not just the facts that it reports, but the facts that it chooses to report. So if this is not a story, a work of God, then it has to be a work of man. And if man is making this story as other religions have done throughout history, I believe that to be true. The question that I pose to you is that when we have the number of eyewitness, we also have a lot of embarrassing testimonies that come along with this. So here's some of the facts that we know, and these are not exhaustive by any means, but the first people to see the resurrection were women, the Marys. That seems rather unfortunate for the gospel story because in the first century, women were not credible historians and they would not be called into a court of law. And so it would be interesting to say that this is a work of man. Why would they choose the first eyewitnesses to be people that couldn't give an accurate testimony? Fact number 2, it seems that the story relays that the disciples were scared. The only people that weren't scared were the women who had to come back and coax and talk the disciples into coming. And so if I were writing this story, my storyline would go something like this. The women were really afraid. They were scared to death. I wasn't afraid. I just went down there. I beat up some people on the way, and I saw the resurrected Christ. It seems that if you were writing this story, it's not a story that you would write. And then last point I would say to this is that Thomas, who seems to be a follower of Jesus, and yet he seems to be very apathetic.
30 seconds.
He's demanding that he touch Jesus. He says that he won't believe Jesus. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And so it's one of these things to say if this is a work of man, it seems that it's a rather interesting work of man because it doesn't paint man in the best light. When you've obviously studied this, when you look at other works of religion, it seems that it's always painting man in a positive light. It's always painting the authors in a positive sense, and yet the gospel seems to be very honest about its assessment.
Oh, I would disagree with that. So we'll jump back to Lord of the Rings,
Rebuttal.
right? So the climax of Lord of the Rings, Frodo is in Mount Doom. He's about to throw the ring into the fire, and what does he do? He puts it on. He completely betrays his entire mission, and it makes him more interesting and more human. We relate to him more because he's failed in that significant way. And in the same reason, I think we relate more to the disciples, and I think we're meant to relate more to the disciples. The disciples are always doubting, right? So you read the story about the doubting Thomas. At the end of that story, when Jesus says, blessed are you who believe, who have not seen. It's almost like he looks at you from the page and looks you in the eye and says, see, you should believe even though you've not seen, right? It's like the story is talking to us, and I think that's the whole point of these characters and why they're portrayed in such a frail and faulty light. Now, as for the women, it makes total sense, actually, if you think about what I just mentioned, right? So in that region, you had this long tradition of Tammuz, Attis, other gods that died and were resurrected. And who are there waiting for them? The women, right? It's the women that are crying for Tammuz. It's an integral part of that story that the wailing brings him back from the dead. So it makes total sense if you write a story about somebody who comes back from the dead in that time and place. Of course, the first people to interact with him are going to be women. But if you look at, and this is the point I was going to make earlier, if you look at Mary, contrast her in John versus in the Synoptic Gospels, you find if you try to harmonize the stories, that Mary is crying in John for a very weird reason, right? So if you try to harmonize the stories, it seems like that she's already seen Jesus resurrected. So why is she being all sad? Well, the reason is because John reverses the order that the story is told. In the Synoptic Gospels, the women come, see the tomb, they see the angels, they see Christ, and then they go tell the disciples, or not in the case of Mark. In John, it's the opposite. They come, they see the empty tomb, they run straight to the disciples and tell them, and then they come back later. And they only see Jesus after they've talked with the disciples. It completely reverses the order of that story, which is not to say that that the author of John made a mistake exactly. He had just had a different purpose. He had a different theology. And so he changed up the characters. And it's very easy for us to understand why an author might change up the characters or change up the plot in order to serve the point he's trying to make. My point is
30
that
seconds.
it seems like that's what's happening also in the Gospels. So go check on that. Compare the story of Mary in John versus in the Synoptics, and you'll see that in John, she's crying for absolutely no good reason.
Okay, Zach, your fifth point.
Okay, if you could jump ahead. So you've already mentioned this, the synoptic issue, right? So you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Now, I found it really interesting that you mentioned earlier that if we were to find between these accounts that there was 100% similarity, that would indicate some collusion. As a matter of fact, that is what we find. Right? And so there are huge sections of Mark that are lifted completely, 100% verbatim, into Matthew and into Luke. And so this has led scholars to conclude that there must be some relationship between these documents. And there's lots of different theories as to why this is the case, but the leading theory is that whoever wrote Matthew and whoever wrote Luke had a copy of Mark on their desk in front of them and were lifting out entire chunks of Mark's story and adding to it. And where do we see this most glaringly? We actually see it on Easter morning. Because Mark does not have a resurrection account. On Easter morning, the women go and they see an empty tomb and they run away, and that's the end of the story. So what you see is the entire crucifixion scene between the synoptics is very similar. But once you get to Easter morning, everything changes and everybody goes off in their own different way, and it's very weird. There's something called an Easter challenge that's been proposed, and I did this very early on. I tried to harmonize all the Easter accounts, starting on Easter morning in all the different Gospels, and it is hard. And there are a number of problems that crop up, and one of them is the problem with Mary crying. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is it's very likely that these were just men working with documents trying to tell their own stories. And whoever wrote Matthew, we don't know who it was. We don't actually know any of the authors. We just call them by these names for tradition's sake. But whoever wrote Matthew wanted to improve on Mark in some way, wanted to change the theology of Mark in some way. Similarly, whoever wrote Luke wanted to change the theology of Mark in some way, in a different way. He may have also had a copy of Matthew, and Matthew might have also had a copy of Luke. We don't actually know. And John, whoever wrote John, went in a completely different direction. All you have to do is read these four accounts together. That's why they're called synoptically. You're supposed to look at them together. And once you start reading them, and the point is not that they contradict each other. The point is why they contradict each other. What point are they trying to make? Because very, very soon, what you'll notice is that there are different theologies coming out as you read through these Gospels.
30 seconds.
And so what the implication of that is that these are not works of pure history. These are works of theology. These are works where people are trying to make a specific theological point. John even says so at the end of his gospel. He says, "This is written so that you might believe." Believe in what? Believe in his particular gospel. Right? These were not combined until well in the 3rd century. There was no canon even until late in the 3rd century, 4th century, really. And so what is the canon? Is the canon a function of the church, or is the church a function of the canon? We don't know.
I'd
All
like
right,
to
rebuttal.
I'd like to just work my way back with the most recent thing you said, and then go back to Mark. So I do agree with you, and I mean all historians would agree with you that the canon wasn't until the late 4th century. But I do think that we could make the case. I mean, we see Athanasius' canon within the middle 2nd century, and he's pretty close to identifying all 23 of the 27 New Testament books. So even though the canon doesn't
I mean
become,
Irenaeus.
no, I think it was Athanasius.
That was in the 4th century.
Was it Athanasius? Why are you doing this to me, man?
Sorry. I think it was Irenaeus in the 2nd century. That
Okay.
First
Yeah,
book.
2nd century. Okay, so but the idea is that there was, even though it didn't become official until the 4th century at Council of Trent, that you still saw it growing. And so I think even though it doesn't become official till late 4th century, I still think we can make the case. I totally agree with you with Mark, with the Synoptic Gospels, that we do see a lot of, not collusion, but we do see a lot of them borrowing from each other. Some would even suggest that maybe there was another document Q that came before them. I don't really think that that's a problem. I think Mark was the first one that got to it. I think if you put Mark in an outline and you put Matthew in an outline, I mean, it's eerily similar on just side by side. Matthew goes into obviously more details. It's a longer book, but I don't think that causes us to necessarily assume collusion. I think that they were dealing with the same story. I think they borrowed from one another. I think that actually lends towards the credibility that the guys knew what was going on. Peter references Paul. Paul references some of the gospel writers. So it seems like they are working together, but they also are working independently. And so even though we do see areas where they agree a little bit too much, I think we have to be careful on this, because in some cases you're saying, well, they agree way too much, and then some you're saying you agree way too little. And so I think we have to be careful, but I would make the case that I think that is exactly the right proportion, that it wasn't exactly the same and it wasn't completely different. And so I think they find a nice middle ground where they do agree on the main points. On some of the periphery issues, number of women, number of angels, last words, I think that you can say there was some personalities. We do see, obviously, the personalities coming out with the gospel writers. Obviously, they all have an agenda. Matthew seems to be trying to identify the kingship of Jesus. Other gospel writers, other New Testament writers are trying to reach the Gentiles. Some are trying to reach the Jews. So I think that their personalities come in. Obviously, Luke is a physician, and so he uses terminologies that Matthew doesn't use as a tax collector. And so I think we do see the differences, and I do think we see the similarities, but I don't think they're enough to say that it would wash the argument out. I think it's right where it needs to be. So,
Okay, that concludes the point by point.